I'm a woodsman by trade, a furniture mechanic by profession. My job is to select and prepare the best wood for the high-end furniture pieces my boss, Mr. Jarvis, insists on crafting. He runs the operation with a stern hand, and when he calls, you don't argue. So, when he told me to spend the night in the forest to oversee a special batch of timber, I didn't hesitate, even though the forecast warned of heavy rain. It was late autumn 2023. I'm 36, and I've been working in these woods near Shelton Ridge in Oregon for almost a decade. This wasn't my first night shift, but it was the first one that required me to camp out. The furniture order was urgent. A luxury client had requested a unique set made from the finest walnut wood we could harvest. Mr. Jarvis wouldn't let anything compromise the quality, not even bad weather. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a sturdy tent, rain gear, a thermos of coffee, my toolbox, and a flashlight. The truck I drove was old but reliable, a beat-up Ford that had seen its fair share of rough terrain. As I left my house, the rain had already started, a light drizzle that promised to worsen. The drive to the worksite took me deep into the forest, far from any paved roads. The rain picked up as I navigated the muddy trail, the headlights cutting through the dark, wet night. By the time I reached the clearing where the trees had been marked for cutting, the downpour was relentless. The sound of the rain hitting the roof of the truck was almost deafening. I stepped out, pulled my hood tight, and surveyed the area. The marked trees stood like sentinels in the darkness, their bright orange tags barely visible in the rain. The campsite was about 50 yards away, a small clearing where the ground was relatively dry. I set up the tent quickly, fumbling with the poles as the rain soaked through my gloves. Once the tent was up, I lit a small lantern and settled inside. The interior was cramped but dry, and I took a moment to catch my breath. My job for the night was straightforward: make sure no one tampered with the wood. Poachers occasionally tried to steal high-quality logs, and Mr. Jarvis didn't trust the usual security measures for this particular batch. Around 10 p.m., I stepped out to check the trees. The rain had turned the ground into a slippery mess, and my boots sank into the mud with each step. I used my flashlight to inspect the markings and make sure everything was in order. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife drowned out by the rain. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't paranoia. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something feels off. I stopped and scanned the area with my flashlight, but all I saw were the raindrops reflecting the light. Back at the tent, I tried to push the unease aside. I brewed some coffee and ate a sandwich, listening to the rain drum against the canvas. But the feeling lingered, a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It wasn't the rain or the wind, but something heavier: footsteps in the mud. They were faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but unmistakable. I turned off the lantern and grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rain and trees. I waited, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. Telling myself it was probably an animal, I zipped up the tent and sat in the dark, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Minutes passed, then an hour. The rain continued, but the forest seemed still. Around 2 a.m., I decided to do another round. The rain had lightened to a steady drizzle, and the air was colder now. I checked the trees one by one, my boots squelching in the mud. Everything seemed fine until I reached the farthest tree. The orange tag was missing. I stared at the bare trunk, my mind racing. The tag hadn't just fallen off, it had been ripped away. I shone the flashlight around, looking for any sign of it, but found nothing. The ground was churned up, as if someone had been walking around. My pulse quickened as I realized the footsteps were back. This time, they were louder, coming from the direction of my tent. I turned and ran, slipping in the mud but managing to keep my balance. When I reached the campsite, my tent was gone. Not collapsed or blown over, gone. The clearing was empty except for the mud and a few scattered footprints. Panic set in. My truck was parked about 50 yards away, and I sprinted toward it, slipping and sliding in the muck. When I reached it, I yanked the door open and jumped inside, locking the doors behind me. The keys were in my pocket, and I fumbled to start the engine. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the forest in front of me. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood in the rain, just beyond the reach of the headlights. They were tall, wearing what looked like a hooded raincoat, but their face was obscured. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. I shifted into reverse and backed up, the tires struggling in the mud. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I didn't waste any time. I drove out of there as fast as the truck would allow, the mud and rain making it a nerve-wracking journey. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop until I was home. The next day, I reported what had happened to Mr. Jarvis. He listened, stone-faced, and then told me to take the week off. When I returned, the clearing had been abandoned. The marked trees were gone, replaced by stumps and mud. I never found out who or what was in the woods that night. All I know is that I'm never taking another night shift, no matter how urgent the job. Some things aren't worth the risk. Camping in the forest wasn't something I did often, but my wife, Mia, and her stepsister, Kara, loved it. They grew up spending summers outdoors, hiking, and sleeping under the stars. I'd married into this tradition, and though I wasn't as outdoorsy as they were, I enjoyed their company enough to tag along. This trip was supposed to be a quiet weekend escape, far from our phones, traffic, and daily life. It was late September, just cool enough to need jackets, but not cold enough to make camping unbearable. We had picked a spot near a small lake in the middle of nowhere, about 3 hours outside a small Colorado town. The drive-in had been rough. The dirt road leading to the campsite was muddy from recent rain, and the last stretch felt more like off-roading than driving. By the time we arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving us to set up our tents in the dark. The rain started lightly that first night. Nothing too bad, just a drizzle that pattered against the fabric of our tents as we drifted off to sleep. I found the sound soothing, almost lulling me into a deeper sleep than I'd expected. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves, but I told myself it was just the wind. The next morning, we woke up to a sky that was more gray than blue. Mia and Kara were already up, boiling water for coffee and discussing whether we should hike to the nearby ridge despite the threatening clouds. I stayed back to reorganize some of the gear. The air was damp, and the smell of wet earth clung to everything. By mid-afternoon, the drizzle had returned. We decided to skip the hike and stick closer to camp. The rain didn't let up, and by evening, it had turned into a steady downpour. We huddled under a tarp, eating dinner and joking about how this would be one of those trips we'd laugh about later. As night fell, the mood shifted. The rain intensified, and the wind picked up, causing the trees to groan under its weight. The fire we tried to build was a lost cause, and we retreated to our tents earlier than usual. I had trouble sleeping that night. The rain was relentless, hammering against the tent with a ferocity that made me wonder if it would hold. The sound of water dripping from the tarp onto the muddy ground was constant. Around midnight, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the rain or an animal moving through the brush, but then I realized it was too rhythmic for either. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, listening intently. The steps were faint but deliberate, circling our campsite. I reached for the flashlight beside me but hesitated to turn it on. My mind raced through logical explanations. It had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, curious about our food. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too human. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing and eventually fell into a restless sleep. When I stepped out of the tent the next morning, the campsite felt off. The rain had lessened, but the ground was a mess of mud and puddles. Mia and Kara were already up, looking around the site. Something was wrong. The cooler we'd hung from a tree to keep away from animals was on the ground, open with its contents scattered. Muddy footprints led away from it, disappearing into the forest. They were human, barefoot, and large. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here. We debated packing up and leaving, but the road out was too slick and treacherous to navigate safely. The best we could do was stay vigilant and keep our knives and bear spray close. We spent the day close to camp, uneasy but trying to stay calm. That night, the rain returned with a vengeance. The wind howled, and the temperature dropped sharply. We'd zipped our tents up tightly, but the dampness still seeped in, chilling us to the bone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were heavier, faster. They circled the camp once before stopping near the tents. I could hear breathing, faint but unmistakable. I lay there, heart pounding, clutching the knife I'd brought with me. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The breathing continued for what felt like hours before fading into the sound of the rain. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came, and with it the horrible truth. There were more footprints around the site, and some of them were much smaller, as if made by a child. The cooler had been raided again, and one of Kara's boots was missing. The tent poles had been tampered with, and a knife we'd left by the campfire was gone. This wasn't random. Someone was watching us, messing with us. We decided to pack up and leave as soon as possible. The road would be bad, but staying felt worse. As we hurried to pack, I kept glancing into the forest, expecting to see someone or something emerge from the trees. But the woods remained eerily still, save for the rain. We piled into the car, mud splattering everywhere as we threw our gear into the back. The drive was slow and treacherous. The mud made the tires slip, and the rain reduced visibility to almost nothing. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as we crawled down the dirt road. Every so often, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing after us. About halfway down the road, we came across something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of rocks stacked in the middle of the path. It hadn't been there when we drove in. I stopped the car, heart racing, as we stared at it in silence. The rocks were wet and glistening, placed carefully, almost ritualistically. I didn't wait to analyze it. I drove around the pile, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The rest of the drive was a blur of mud, rain, and tension. When we finally reached the main road, relief washed over me. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person standing completely still. We didn't stop until we reached a motel in the nearest town. That night, as we locked the door and double-checked the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. Even now, months later, I find myself waking up in the middle of the night, listening for footsteps outside my window. We never figured out who or what was out there that weekend. But sometimes, when it rains, I swear I can hear those footsteps again. I never liked camping. Maybe it was the open air, the vulnerability of sleeping under a thin sheet of fabric. or the way the woods seemed alive at night. But in my line of work, you don't always get a choice. My name's David Miller, a 38-year-old sergeant with over a decade of experience in law enforcement. My partner, Mike Sanchez, was 10 years my junior, fresh-faced, eager, and a bit too curious for his own good. That curiosity would be our undoing. It was the summer of 2015 when we got the tip. A small-time crook, Eddie Novak, had skipped bail and disappeared. Novak wasn't just any criminal. He was connected, someone who knew the kinds of secrets people would kill to keep hidden. We'd been tracking him for weeks with no luck until a hiker reported seeing someone matching his description camping deep in the national forest about 3 hours outside our jurisdiction. The higher-ups didn't want to spend resources on a manhunt, so Mike and I volunteered to check it out. We packed light, just what we needed for an overnight trip. A tent, some freeze-dried food, a first aid kit, and, of course, our sidearms. The forest was dense, the kind of place where the canopy blocked out the sun, and the air felt thick with moisture. It was a 2-mile hike from the nearest road to where Novak was supposedly spotted. As we trudged through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We reached the reported campsite just as the sun began to set. The spot was tucked into a clearing near a creek, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. At first glance, it looked like no one had been there in days. The fire pit was cold, the tent unoccupied, and there were no signs of recent activity. But something felt off. The tent was too neat, almost staged. Inside, we found a sleeping bag, a few canned goods, and a notebook. Mike flipped through it while I searched the surrounding area for tracks or other clues. The notebook was strange, filled with sketches of trees, cryptic symbols, and what looked like random numbers. Mike joked that it was just the ramblings of a bored man, but I wasn't convinced. Something about the symbols felt deliberate, like they were meant to mean something. As darkness fell, we decided to set up our own camp about 50 yards away from Novak's. The forest was eerily quiet that night, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. We took turns keeping watch, but nothing happened. By morning, I was almost convinced Novak had moved on, and we'd wasted a trip. The next day, we split up to cover more ground. Mike went upstream while I followed a faint trail heading deeper into the woods. About half a mile in, I found something that stopped me cold. A blood-stained shirt tangled in the branches of a bush. It was dry, suggesting the blood wasn't fresh, but it still sent a chill down my spine. I radioed Mike, but he didn't respond. I tried to stay calm, telling myself his radio was probably just out of range. I retraced my steps back to camp, but Mike wasn't there. His pack was still in the tent, untouched. I waited for an hour, then 2, but he didn't show. By late afternoon, I decided to follow the trail he'd taken upstream. The creek was shallow, its water clear enough to see the rocks at the bottom. I walked for what felt like hours, calling out for Mike every few minutes. Eventually, I found his footprints in the mud, along with a second set leading in the same direction. They were larger, heavier, likely a man's. My stomach tightened. Novak? I followed the tracks until I found Mike's radio lying in the dirt. It was broken, the casing cracked like someone had stomped on it. Nearby, I found signs of a struggle, scuffed earth, broken branches, and a smear of blood on a tree trunk. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay focused. I wasn't leaving without my partner. The tracks led me to a cave hidden behind a thicket of bushes. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, it was damp and smelled of mildew. I drew my weapon and stepped carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cave wasn't deep, but it opened into a small chamber at the back. That's where I found him, Novak. He was sitting against the wall, his face pale, his clothes torn and dirty. He wasn't alone. Mike was there too, lying face down on the ground, unmoving. My heart sank. Novak didn't resist. He just stared at me with hollow eyes as I cuffed him and checked on Mike. He was alive, but barely. His face was bruised, and his breathing was shallow. I radioed for backup, though I knew it would be hours before anyone could reach us. I dragged Novak out of the cave and secured him to a tree while I tended to Mike. I gave him water and did my best to clean his wounds, but he was slipping in and out of consciousness. Novak didn't say a word the entire time, just sat there staring into the woods like he was waiting for something. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant animal cries. I kept my weapon close, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I shone my flashlight into the trees but saw nothing. Then I realized Novak was smiling. It wasn't a grin of fear or defiance. It was satisfaction. He knew something I didn't. By dawn, Mike was stable enough to move, but we were still miles from the road. I hauled him onto my back and started the trek, dragging Novak behind me. Every so often, I'd hear those footsteps again, always just out of sight. I was running on adrenaline, every shadow a potential threat. When we finally reached the trailhead, I almost cried with relief. A search and rescue team was waiting, alerted by my earlier radio call. Mike was rushed to the hospital, and Novak was taken into custody. A week later, I got a call from the investigating officers. They'd searched the cave and found more than I could have imagined. Bones, dozens of them, some decades old. Novak hadn't been camping. He'd been hiding in plain sight, living in those woods for years, preying on anyone who got too close. Mike recovered, but he wasn't the same. Neither was I. The woods had taken something from us, something we couldn't get back. To this day, I can't walk through a forest without feeling like I'm being watched, because out there, in the places we don't go, the monsters are real. It was the summer of 2023 when my team and I set off for the camping trip that would change everything. We were a group of researchers, each of us deeply involved in insect studies, but none of us had ever quite experienced what would unfold. The plan was simple: find a remote spot in the woods to camp for a week while conducting fieldwork on insect populations. We were based in the Midwest, somewhere tucked far from the usual trails, in a dense forest area that hadn't seen many visitors. The plan was clear: no distractions, no noise, just us and the bugs. The drive was long, stretching well into the night, but we finally made it to the campsite after hours on a bumpy dirt road. It was already dark by the time we set up camp. The firewood had been gathered, tents erected, and the small lanterns we'd brought flickered weakly in the vast, surrounding darkness. Our team consisted of me, the project lead at 32 years old, Emma, 29, our biologist, and two other specialists, Grant, 35, who handled the technical side of things, and Lily, 25, a young and eager entomologist who was just starting her fieldwork. We didn't talk much that evening, too tired from the drive and eager to get some sleep before the real work began the next morning. By morning, the forest looked different. It wasn't like any forest I had camped in before. There was an oppressive stillness about it, the air heavy, and the trees loomed over us like silent sentinels. The kind of trees that felt old, maybe too old, their roots thick, gnarled, and tangled deep under the forest floor. We set up our stations near a clearing, where Grant started his mapping, Emma began the first of her insect surveys, and Lily and I prepared to collect some samples for our research. The sounds of the forest were constant: the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of birds, and the hum of insects flying through the air. The closer we got to the clearing's edge, though, the more I noticed something strange. There was an odd quietness in the part of the forest just beyond the clearing.
No insects.
Not a single fly, not a buzz, nothing. It was as though the forest had split in two. On one side, life thrived, and on the other, it seemed deathly still. I mentioned it to Lily, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just an anomaly in the habitat we hadn't yet discovered. She didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first few days were uneventful. We cataloged insects, took samples, and set up traps for our studies. But on the third day, I made a discovery. I was walking a little off the beaten path, searching for a specific species of beetle I had read about in the area when I found something strange beneath a thick layer of leaves. It was small, barely noticeable at first, but as I knelt down to examine it, I realized what it was. A nest, but not an ordinary nest. It was made of something that didn't belong in the forest, a mix of what looked like human hair and the remains of insects. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. There was no way this could be a natural occurrence. I gathered the sample carefully and returned to camp, my mind racing. I showed it to Emma and Grant. They didn't have much to say about it, except that the composition was unusual, something they couldn't immediately identify. But as the sun began to set that evening, an uncomfortable feeling settled in. The air felt heavier, colder. It wasn't a temperature drop, but something more, something I couldn't quite explain. That night, the sounds of the forest seemed different. The usual hum of insects had faded, and the wind carried an unfamiliar scent. It was subtle, but it stank of decay. I heard rustling from the treeline, distant, but it felt close. Something was watching us. I glanced at my team, but they were all lost in their own thoughts, probably too exhausted from the day's work to notice anything out of the ordinary. I stayed awake longer than I should have, staring into the shadows beyond our campfire, waiting for the feeling of unease to pass. Didn't. I was relieved when the morning came, but the oddity didn't stop. During our morning rounds, we noticed more of the same. Insect traps had been tampered with, and several samples were missing. It was like someone or something was going out of its way to disrupt our research. By the fifth day, things had escalated. Lily went missing. She had been setting up new traps near the edge of the clearing when we last saw her. But when we went to check on her a few hours later, there was no sign of her. Her equipment, however, was still there, untouched. The sense of dread that had been building all week finally hit me full force. We split up to search, but I knew deep down that she wasn't lost in the traditional sense. This wasn't a case of her wandering off. Something had happened to her. As I made my way through the woods, I couldn't help but feel like I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't understand. The forest had changed overnight. It felt more alive now, more oppressive. The air was thick, and even the trees seemed to whisper as I passed beneath them. Hours passed, and there was no sign of Lily. I was starting to lose hope when I found something disturbing. It was another nest, but this one was larger, and something darker had been added to it. There, in the center of the nest, was a torn piece of Lily's jacket. My stomach dropped. She had been here, but she wasn't alone. Something else had been with her, something that wasn't human. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding in my chest. Emma and Grant were there, looking just as terrified as I felt. We were trapped, surrounded by something in the woods that didn't want us there. By now, we all knew it. We could hear the rustling from the trees, the sounds of something moving just out of sight, always circling us. And then there was the smell again, stronger than ever, like something was rotting just beyond the tree line. We tried to leave that night, but as we packed up, I realized something was wrong with our equipment. Our vehicles wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, but there was no power. It felt like the forest had swallowed our escape. We were stranded. The only option left was to dig in. We barricaded ourselves in the tents, armed with whatever tools we could find. But it wasn't enough. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. The rustling was more frequent now, and the whispering had turned into something like a growl. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't wildlife. The night dragged on. I don't know how much time passed, but when the morning finally came, I stepped outside to find a sight I'll never forget. The campsite had been completely changed. It wasn't the mess of a wild animal or the aftermath of some predator. No, it was deliberate. The trees had been cut, their trunks peeled back, exposing strange symbols carved into their bark. The ground had been disturbed, and in the center of it all was Lily's pack, torn to pieces, her research notebooks scattered across the ground. But she was still nowhere to be found. We packed up, desperate to leave, but something wasn't right. I felt like the forest itself was pushing us back, keeping us here. As we made our way back to the vehicles, it was clear that whatever had been stalking us hadn't finished with us yet. Something was still out there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed all of us. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 24. My mom had talked me into joining a camping trip with our neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Fowler, and one of her friends, Officer Reed, who was a local cop. I didn't usually spend my weekends like this, but Mom insisted it would be good for me to get some fresh air. She said something about reconnecting with nature and how the Fowlers were good company. Honestly, I think she just didn't want to go alone. The Fowlers were in their mid-50s. Mr. Fowler was the kind of guy who could fix anything around the house and seemed to know a little about everything. His wife, Sarah, was always smiling, but something about her seemed guarded, like she was always waiting for something bad to happen. Officer Reed, on the other hand, was in his late 40s, tall and built like he'd been in law enforcement forever. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice carried this authority that made everyone listen. We packed up and drove out to a campsite about 2 hours from town. It was one of those spots that wasn't completely off the grid but wasn't crowded either. The site was nestled deep in a forest, with a small, clear lake nearby. It was perfect, isolated enough to feel like a real escape but still close enough to a ranger station for emergencies. We arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. We set up 2 tents, one for Mom and me and the other for the Fowlers. Officer Reed brought his own small tent, saying he preferred the space. As we unloaded the gear, I noticed something strange. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I'd been camping before, and usually you'd hear birds, squirrels, or the rustle of leaves. But here, it was like the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, blaming my overactive imagination, and got to work setting up camp. That evening, we built a fire and cooked hot dogs and marshmallows. It was nice, sitting around the fire and watching the flames dance. For a while, I forgot about how unnervingly quiet the woods were. Mr. Fowler told a few stories about past camping trips, and even Officer Reed cracked a smile at one point. But then, as the fire burned low and the conversation faded, we all heard it. A single sharp snap of a twig. Everyone froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. It came from the woods, just beyond the glow of the firelight. Mr. Fowler grabbed a flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but all it showed were trees and shadows. "Probably a deer," Mom said, trying to sound casual. We all nodded, but no one looked convinced. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every rustle of leaves or creak of branches outside the tent made my heart race. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, I drifted off, but it wasn't restful. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. Mr. Fowler led the way with a map, pointing out trails and landmarks. We hiked for hours, following a path that looped around the lake. The woods felt different in the daylight, less eerie, more alive. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something, lurking in the trees. I didn't say anything, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I noticed Mrs. Fowler doing the same thing. When we got back to camp, we found something that stopped us in our tracks. The fire pit we'd built the night before was scattered. The logs were thrown around, and the ashes were smeared across the ground. At first, we thought it might have been an animal, but then we saw the footprints. Human footprints. They were faint, but they were there, leading away from the camp and into the woods. Maybe some kids messing around, Mr. Fowler said, though his voice lacked conviction. Officer Reed didn't say anything. He just scanned the tree line, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. That night, we all stayed up late, sitting around the fire and keeping watch. The atmosphere was tense. Even Mr. Fowler, who usually joked around, was quiet. Around midnight, we heard it again, that same sharp snap of a twig. This time, it was closer. Officer Reed stood up, flashlight in one hand and his other hand on his gun. He shined the light into the trees, sweeping it back and forth. The beam caught something, a figure darting behind a tree. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the woods. The rest of us jumped to our feet, hearts pounding. Reed moved toward the tree, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. But when he got there, the figure was gone. We spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every sound. By morning, we were exhausted and decided to cut the trip short. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the unsettling campsite behind. As we loaded the cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I scanned the woods one last time, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A face peeking out from behind a tree. But when I blinked, it was gone. The ride home was quiet. No one talked about what happened, and no one needed to. We all felt it, that lingering sense of unease, like we'd escaped something dangerous without fully understanding what it was. When we got back to town, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about a missing person last seen near the same campsite. The details were sparse, but it sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder if it was connected to what we'd experienced. I haven't been camping since. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. After months of work and stress, I needed a break. It wasn't my first time camping, but it had been years since I'd done it solo. I picked a spot deep in the forest of Montana. The area was known for its isolation, which was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me, nature, and silence. The year was 2018, and I was 34. I had read about this particular area online. A remote stretch near a small river, surrounded by thick trees and miles from the nearest road. It sounded perfect. The drive out there was uneventful. I left early in the morning, my SUV packed with everything I needed: tent, food, water, tools, a portable stove, and a first aid kit. The weather was cool but clear, a typical early autumn day. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air smelled fresh, earthy. I parked my car on a dirt road about 5 miles from the camping spot and hiked the rest of the way in, my backpack heavy but manageable. The trail was overgrown in parts, but I had a GPS app and a paper map just in case. By mid-afternoon, I found the spot I had marked. A small clearing near the river, flat enough to pitch a tent and far enough from the water to avoid any flooding. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No birds, no wind, just the sound of the river and my own breathing. I set up my tent quickly, organized my gear, and started a small fire. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was eating dinner, a simple meal of canned chili and bread, under a canopy of stars. The solitude was both calming and eerie. I told myself that this was what I needed, a break from the constant noise of the world. That first night was uneventful. I slept well, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The sound of the river was soothing, and the thick trees around the clearing made me feel enclosed, protected. I woke up early the next morning, made coffee, and spent the day exploring the area. I followed the river upstream, found a few interesting rocks, and even spotted some deer tracks. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. The second night was when things started to feel off. As I was sitting by the fire after dinner, I noticed something strange. The forest, which had been quiet the entire time I'd been there, seemed even quieter. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the river in the distance. I shrugged it off, blaming my overactive imagination. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. and fell asleep quickly, tired from the day's hike. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay still, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow through the tent. That's when I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started racing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were deliberate, slow, and heavy. Too heavy to be a small animal. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like someone clearing their throat. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably human. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. My mind raced. Who would be out here, miles from any road, in the middle of the night? I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness inside the tent, but I didn't dare unzip the flap. I sat there, flashlight in hand, listening. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen, or the river had carried a strange noise. I lay back down, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I found footprints near my camp. They were faint, but they were their boot prints, not animal tracks. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail coming in, and this area wasn't a popular camping spot. Whoever had been here had come after dark. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hunter or another camper who stumbled upon my site by accident. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I spent most of the day near camp, not wanting to stray too far. I kept glancing around, feeling like I was being watched. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I built a bigger fire than usual and kept my flashlight and knife close. That night, the sounds came again. This time, it was louder. More footsteps, closer to the tent. I sat up, clutching the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The steps stopped, and I thought I heard breathing just outside the tent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. I didn't move. I didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Eventually, the noises stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to close my eyes. When the first light of dawn broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, knife in hand. The camp looked untouched, but there were more boot prints circling the tent. That was enough for me. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. The hike back to the car was the longest 5 miles of my life. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept expecting someone or something to step out from behind a tree. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors before starting the engine. I drove out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow, not stopping until I reached a small gas station miles away. I sat in the parking lot, hands shaking, trying to process what had happened. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I never went back to that forest, and I never camped alone again. Sometimes I think about those footprints, the breathing, and the fact that whoever was out there didn't try to hurt me. But the scariest part is knowing they were there, watching, waiting, and I'll never know why. It was the summer of 2014, and my cousin Ethan and I decided to go camping. We were both in our early 20s, eager for an adventure that didn't involve phones, computers, or the usual distractions of life. We picked a spot about 3 hours from home, deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was one of those places you hear about but rarely see. Vast, quiet, and untouched by civilization. It felt perfect for a weekend of fishing, hiking, and just being outdoors. We packed everything we thought we'd need. A tent, sleeping bags, a cooler filled with food, a couple of flashlights, and a map of the area. Ethan also brought his hunting knife and a hatchet for chopping wood. We weren't planning to hunt, but it felt better to have something like that with us, just in case. We didn't expect trouble, though. The area wasn't known for dangerous animals or anything like that, just miles and miles of trees and lakes. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dirt road as we drove deeper into the forest. There was no one else around, and the trail leading to the campsite looked barely used. That was fine with us. We wanted peace and quiet, and that's exactly what we got. The campsite was on a small hill overlooking a lake. It was beautiful. The water was still and dark, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. We set up the tent near the edge of the hill, where the ground was flat and the view of the lake was perfect. Ethan started a fire while I unpacked our gear. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, we were settled in, enjoying the crackling fire and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The first night was uneventful. We cooked some hot dogs over the fire, talked about nothing in particular, and stared at the stars. It was the kind of night that makes you forget about the rest of the world. I fell asleep easily, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore in the distance. The next day, we decided to explore the area. We followed a narrow trail that wound through the woods and eventually led to another, smaller lake. This one was surrounded by thick underbrush and felt even more remote. We spent a few hours fishing, but the fish weren't biting. After a while, we gave up and headed back to camp. It was late afternoon by the time we returned. The fire had died down, so we gathered more wood and got it going again. As we sat around the fire, I noticed something odd. There were marks on the ground near the edge of the campsite, just a few feet from the tent. At first, I thought they were from an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the more I looked, the less they made sense. The marks were deep, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt. They led away from the camp, disappearing into the trees. I showed Ethan, but he shrugged it off. Probably just a bear looking for food, he said. That made sense, I guess. We had been cooking outside, and the smell might have attracted something. Still, it bothered me. The marks didn't look like tracks. They looked like grooves, as if something had been dragged. We decided to keep the fire going all night, just in case. The light and smoke would help keep animals away. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. Even the usual sounds of crickets and frogs seemed muted. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, but when I peeked out of the tent, there was nothing there, just darkness and shadows. The next morning, I found more of those strange marks, this time closer to the tent. They were deeper than before, and they seemed to circle the campsite. Ethan tried to brush it off again, but I could tell he was starting to get uneasy. We decided to pack up and leave that day instead of staying another night. As we loaded the car, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see something or someone watching us. But there was nothing, just the trees and the lake and the empty trail leading back to the main road. The drive home was quiet. Ethan and I didn't talk much, and when we did, it wasn't about the marks or the strange sounds. We didn't want to admit that something had scared us. But the truth is, I still think about that trip. I still wonder what made those marks and why the woods felt so wrong that night. I haven't been camping since,